Second paper in the afternoon session is by the four authors in Japan, and the title is on the zero inflation rate norm of the Japanese firm, and paper is presented by Mr. Hogen from Research Department of Bank of Japan. He's one of the promising young economists in the Bank of Japan. Okay, go ahead. 30 minutes.
Wow. I didn't expect that. Thank you. I'm flattered. Thank you. Okay, so let's start. The paper I'm presenting today is on the zero inflation norm of Japanese firm with my colleagues Kakuho Furukawa, Kazuki Otaka, and Naosudo. The views are of my own and do not reflect those of the BOJ. Okay, so the aim of this paper is to explore the causes of the observed zero inflation norm in Japan for this past 25 years. The presentation has mainly two parts. In the first half, I'll go over the micro price facts in Japan. The key questions here are, for example, what happened to micro price dynamics when the zero norm became prevalent? Was it goods or services? Was it upward or downward changes of prices? In the second half, we construct a simple menu cost model, extending the model of Nakamura and Steinson, and examine if the model is able to account for the micro price evidence. We are especially interested in how much of the micro price evidence can be explained by changes in trend inflation. If the model with trend inflation, trend inflation explains all, then zero norm is not unique to Japan. In case the model does not explain all, then we explore any changes in key parameters as needed, such as menu costs or the elasticity of demand. In the next couple of slides, I'll talk about the motivation, starting with basic facts about the zero norm. The Japanese economy had seen a quarter century of low inflation until recently. A notable feature of firms' price-setting behavior during this period was the increase of items without changes in prices, and we're going to call this phenomenon the zero norm. For analytical purposes, we divide our samples into three phases: the high inflation phase before 1995 as phase 1, the low inflation or deflation period as phase 2, and the recent high inflation after 2021 as phase 3, and we focus on the changes over these phases. The left figure is the distribution of price changes for items, including in the CPI, where we see many items stuck at the zero inflation region. The right chart shows the time path of the share of zero inflation items. A key fact to note here is that zero inflation items were mainly concentrated in services. The share remained at an elevated level until the late 2010s, when it started to decline after around 2021. So what is the zero norm? Watanabe and Watanabe 2018 say, for example, that the zero norm is considered as an implicit understanding among sellers and buyers that prices will not be revised each year. And what has the norm brought about? In terms of policy, overcoming the zero norm has been sometimes referred to as a key challenge for the Bank of Japan in achieving price stability. For example, former Governor Kuroda stated in his speech that, I quote, the primary reason for being unable to achieve the price stability target of 2% is that this 0% anchoring of inflation expectations, in other words, a zero inflation norm, has been extremely persistent. Of course, we generally do not have norms or zero norms in modern Keynesian sticky price models. To address the zero norm, in our theoretical analysis, we consider a situation where firms see additional costs to deviate from zero inflation. So what do we mean by that? We consider two types of such costs. The first is changes in menu costs. As shown in Zubaraki et al., menu costs include not only physical costs, but also various types of costs that depend not only on firms, but also customers' characteristics. The costs could change over time depending on the economic conditions. So if firms gradually lose skills of negotiating price changes as low inflation period persists, then costs of negotiation could emerge as a rise in menu costs. And the second profile is changes in the curvature of the demand curve. Theoretically, a higher kinkedness of consumers' demand elasticity, namely when you know that the demand towards your goods become more sensitive to your price change, then you become more reluctant to change your price. So indeed, several existing studies indicate that a large decline in aggregate demand during the last decades in Japan have incurred severe price competition among firms, which in turn increased elasticity of demand to price hikes. Okay, so the menu cost profile directly makes firms less active for price changes, and the kinked demand profile makes firms more cautious for price changes. So that's our take on the zero norm. Our paper is related to mainly three strands of literature. First and most importantly, it's related to the enormous amount of research on Japan's chronic deflation. Second, micro-pricing in Japan, and third, use of menu cost models. Regarding the first, we would like to stress that to the best of our knowledge, our paper is the first which tries to explain the formation of the zero norm theoretically. By doing so, we are able to tell whether we should take the zero norm as a surprise or not based on a standard pricing model, and then think about whether we are likely to see the same events going forward or in some other countries. I want to also note that changes in trend inflation, norm-like reluctance of price changes of firms arising from losing customers when they raise prices are all discussed in existing studies on the zero norm in Japan. So our study complements rather than replaces these studies by quantifying the role of each factors. Okay, so now I want to dive into the micro price evidence. In Japan, we use the underlying data for Japan's CPI called the Retail Price Survey from 1990 to 2023. These are item city level data, and we have approximately 100 services and 300 goods used for analysis. We remove temporary price changes using the running mode filter of Kehoe and Midrigan. I think Deputy Governor covered some of these parts, so I'll try to be brief. So as an overview of facts, the left panel shows the frequency or the extensive margin of price changes, and the right panel shows the size, the intensive margin of price changes. The frequency of price changes for services shown by the thick blue line in the left panel declined after entering phase 2. It remained at a remarkably low level until it has risen in phase 3. In terms of the size of price changes for services shown by the thick blue line on the right, this had risen modestly from phase 1 to phase 2 in services. When we decompose the frequency of price changes by directions, frequency of increases for services shown by the thick blue line on the left fell noticeably from phase 1 to 2, remaining around that level until phase 3. Meanwhile, frequency of decreases, which is the thin blue line on the left chart, for services hardly risen or risen modestly during these periods. Okay, so this figure shows the item level distribution of frequencies of price changes in services where the noticeable fall in price increases and the modest rise in price decreases in phases 1 to 2 can be seen for most of the items. Okay, so next up, this figure decomposes sectoral inflation rates into contributions from frequency and size. As well documented in the literature, such as Klenow and Krivtsov, it can be seen that a large part of the variation in inflation can be explained by changes in frequency, which is shown by the dark blue bars, rather than size for both goods and services. And this is also true at the item level. This figure shows the distribution of correlation between counterfactual inflation and the actual inflation at the item level. The thick blue line is the distribution, assuming that the size is fixed at the historical level and the frequencies bounce around. And the thin blue line fixes the frequencies and lets the size fluctuate. So these distributions show that for both goods and services, fixing the size and accounting for changes in the frequency, the thick blue line performs much better where the frequency, where the average correlation is about 0.9. So these facts show that frequency, or I should say the extensive margin, matters for inflation, which is consistent with predictions from state-dependent pricing models. Okay, so we're going to dive into the model investigations. The main underlying question here is shown in the second bullet. Do changes in the inflation rate alone explain all of the observations, or are there any other elements that we need to consider? To answer this question, we proceed in 3 steps. In step 1, we calibrate the model to match the observed micro price setting moments, frequency and size, of the high inflation period in the early 1990s in phase 1. And in step 2, we do a Nakamura and Steinson exercise and feed the aggregate inflation rate into the model, deriving model-generated frequency and size in phase 2 and 3, and see how the fit goes. And in step 3, we explore how much of changes in other parameter values are needed, if any, to bring the model close to the data. So this is a really simple explanation slide for the setup. We construct a simple menu cost model, extending the model of Nakamura and Steinson 2008 QJE paper. It's partial equilibrium. Each firm produces a differentiated good, and its contemporaneous profit, which is shown here, has 3 features. First, as shown in the red area, we assume firms have to pay additional menu costs, denoted K plus or K minus, which are in units of labor when changing prices. In the baseline, we consider asymmetric menu costs, but also investigate how the model behaves with symmetric menu costs, which is rather standard in the literature. Second, to capture effects from strategic complementarities, as shown in the green area, we assume quasi-kink to demand structure of households along the lines of Kimball. The curvature parameter here is denoted eta, and more negative values of this parameter is associated with stronger strategic complementarities. Third, as shown in the blue area, firm-level costs depend on idiosyncratic productivity shocks. Firm-specific productivity shocks follow an AR1 process. And also in the second equation, we also assume that the aggregate price level follows a random walk with a deterministic inflation trend labeled mu. In terms of optimization, there are 2 state variables, the relative price and productivity, and each firm solves this profit maximization problem. This table shows the calibration results of phase 1 for Japan. And for reference, we also calculated cases using the US data. There are a couple of things to note here. First, for Japan, there's a noticeable asymmetry regarding menu costs for upward and downward price changes, K plus and K minus, in services. For example, downward price changes in Japan, 2.4% of labor inputs are needed, while 1% is needed for upward price changes. This result could, to some extent, be considered as consistent with the observation that downward nominal rigidities were present in Japan until the late 1990s. Second, the menu cost asymmetry is reversed for goods in Japan. That is, menu costs are larger for upward price changes than downward price changes. Third, menu costs tend to be larger in Japan than in the US. For example, when you compare the menu cost of the services, the qualitative feature that the cost for downside is larger is similar, but the magnitude is much different. The obstacle is 0.9 for the US and 2.4 is Japan. So there seems to be asymmetries, but the degree is much larger for Japan. Now we move on to step 2. So in the next couple of slides, we hold the calibrated parameters in the early 1990s fixed and investigate how far we can go with just changes in trend inflation. To ensure robustness, we construct 2 types of models. The first one is the aggregate model, which is a model calibrated to the aggregate frequency, size, and inflation rate of the service sector. And the second are item-level models, where we model each item separately by calibrating them to the item-level frequency, size, and inflation. In this case, no sectoral interaction is assumed. Okay, so this slide shows the results of the baseline aggregate model. The 3 figures show the developments of actual frequencies shown by the thick blue line, and the model simulated path shown with the thin blue lines. The model is able to track the developments of the actual aggregate, frequencies qualitatively for both directions. However, as shown in the right, when we aggregate them, it predicts much smaller changes in the frequency from phase 1 to 2 compared with the data. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is the case with symmetric menu costs shown with the dotted lines. The right chart shows that the model can only account for a smaller decline in the frequency, which in turn underscores the importance of asymmetric menu costs. So the results here are in line with Alvarez's proposition that in low inflation countries, movements in inflation doesn't affect frequency. So yeah, so that's true. We also run 2 more experiments. The thin blue line show the case using US services parameters, and the green line are results with the Japanese good parameters. As shown in the right, the total frequency of price changes barely moves with changes with trend inflation because the upward and downward frequencies almost offset each other. This chart shows results of the item level models. The gray shaded areas are the interquartile range of the model predictions, which show similar patterns as the data, but again, not enough to account for changes in total frequencies. Okay, so in sum, as shown in the left chart, qualitatively, the aggregate model correctly predicts a rise in the share of zero inflation rate items from phase 1 to 2, and its decline from phase 2 to 3. Quantitatively, however, for example, only about half of the rise of the share from phase 1 to 2 is explained by the decline in the actual inflation rate at best. As shown in the right panel, the item level models predict that frequencies are underestimated from phase 1 to 2 for more than half of the items, just by the trend inflation profile. So now we put our hands on the other D parameters, right? And move on to phase 3 and calibrate key parameters such as the upper menu cost parameter, the curvature parameter by phase to match the observed moments. As summarized in this table, changes in these D parameters have different implications for frequency and size, which in turn helps us identify the sign and size of these changes. For example, when we increase the size of the upper menu cost, this decreases the frequency for both directions and increases the size. Okay. The curvature of the demand is more complex, and I think it's more interesting. And the response depends, we find that the response depends on the level of inflation. That is, when inflation is low, higher curvature generally reduces the frequency and size due to enhanced strategic complementarities. However, when inflation is high, more degree of curvature increases the upward frequency. This is because firms change their prices more quickly so that their relative prices are aligned with the prices of other firms because a high trend inflation rate makes their relative prices smaller. We attribute unexplained parts of the microprice evidence to changes in model parameters. So for ensuring robustness, we consider 5 different cases. The variation comes from which model we use, which parameters to adjust, and whether we use the proxy for the variance of the idiosyncratic shock. I don't have time to cover how we construct this, but conceptually the proxy is constructed as the cross-sectional variation of input cost growth, which is shown in the appendix, and whether we have the option to use this or not. So for example, in the baseline model, what we do is that we use the aggregate model, adjust the upper menu cost and elasticity while feeding in the proxy for the variance, and target the upper frequency and total absolute size. Okay, so these are the estimated values of the 2 parameters based on the various approaches from phase 1 to 3. The left chart here shows the evolution of the size of menu costs, and the right panel is the degree of the curvature of the demand curve. The lower, the more kinkedness. For the item level results, we show the median and the range across items using the bars. All of the approaches tend to agree that menu costs and curvature are higher during the low inflation period of phase 2 than phase 1 and 3. In other words, this indicates that firms became more inactive and more cautious in phase 2 when the zero norm was most pronounced. So indeed, these changes in the parameter values are consistent with existing views about the zero norm, at least qualitatively. For example, a higher menu cost agrees with the emergence of a social norm in the sense that it implies that it has become more costly for firms to deviate from a zero inflation rate than before. A higher kinkedness of the demand curve also agrees with existing research that emphasize the role of strategic complementarities stemming from a higher curvature in the demand curve and explaining the zero inflation norm. This slide shows the time path of a parameter breakdown of the frequency and size of price changes based on the baseline approach. First, as shown in the left chart, the decline in the frequency from phase 1 to 2 was caused by not only decline in the inflation, which is shown by the dark blue bars, but also by larger menu costs and higher curvature. Second, increases in size was mainly driven by larger variance or idiosyncratic shocks. Now I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between inflation, menu costs, and curvature. So in our model, these are assumed to be mutually uncorrelated by structure, but previous studies on the zero inflation norm sometimes discuss the norm or the kinkedness of demand curve as a consequence of a fall in the actual inflation rate, and sometimes as a reason for why the inflation rate has not gone up by more. This figure shows the correlogram between the aggregate inflation rate of the service sector and the time series of menu costs and elasticity estimates based on the aggregate model. So increases in menu costs and heightening of the curvature lagged decline in inflation about 3 to 4 years. That is, the menu cost rise and the kinkedness of the demand curve became larger 3 or 4 years after a decline in the inflation rate. So I don't mean to talk about causality here, but this is what we got. These observations are consistent with the view that the experience of a prolonged period of low inflation and deflation following the bursting of the bubble in the early 1990s has formed expectations among households and firms that prices should not be changed, resulting in the emergence of the zero inflation norm. Okay, as a side check, this table shows the relationship from the item level models. Using item level estimates, we conducted panel regressions in which the dependent variable is the change in the estimated parameter values, and the explanatory variables include changes in the item level inflation rate and a set of control variables. We got similar results at the item level as well. Our estimates indicate that Decrease in the inflation rate led to a larger menu costs and higher curvature of demand as well. For changes in menu costs, the coefficient on the inflation rate is not so different among private or public services, but for the changes in the curvature of demand, we see that this is only significant for private services and not 5 minutes. This is not significant for public services, which shows that we were able to capture some degree of heterogeneity that these sectors, the competitive environment that these sectors face. Okay, so I want to wrap up. Yeah. So let me conclude. So I think one of our largest takeaways from our exercise is shown in the second bullet, that roughly half of the emergence of the zero norm can be explained by a decline in trend inflation. Here, size and asymmetry of menu costs that are observed in Japan's service prices in the early 1990s might have amplified the effects. So that's one takeaway. The second takeaway is that we also show that in the period of low inflation, firms became less active and more cautious in price changes than what the model suggests. And these are coming from changes in the D parameters. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Discussant is Dr. Paolo Pesenti, New York Fed. 15 minutes.
So it's one. Excellent. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to Masaki. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss. This is a very remarkable paper and topic of key interest for both academic and policy debates. What I want to do is just to review quickly the key findings. I will have some comments, but most crucially, you're going to see some red statements. These are questions in bold and red, and the hope is that this can spur some floor conversation. In fact, there is a lot of continuity between this paper and the conversation we had this morning. So the questions I'm going to ask are going to echo some of the questions that we already asked before. In a nutshell, the papers clearly points out that starting in the early 90s, there was a significant increase from 19 to 46% in the share of Japanese firms that kept prices unchanged for a prolonged period, the so-called zero norm. This points to a persistent 0% anchoring of inflation expectation, despite the 2% price stability target, and John might disagree, but this was not ideal, not for the Bank of Japan, and perhaps not for the society as a whole. There was a fall in aggregate inflation in the early 90s that seems to be explaining about 50% of emergence of a zero norm. So the papers ask most in detail how to rationalize the rest, why, how could he, is it just a matter of low inflation? Obviously not, something else must have happened. About the data, the paper studies macro price dynamics across several dimensions. Goods versus service came up in the conversation this morning. They look at upward versus downward changes. They look at big versus small adjustments. They have retail prices, monthly averages by item and city or stores, and about 100 services and 300 goods. The bottom line is that the zero norm is mostly affected by changes in the service sector, and within the service sector is broad-based across items, so it's not caused by some outliers. About the frequency of price changes in the service sector, it falls from phase 1 to 2 and increases more recently. In fact, the frequency in 93 is more or less equal to the frequency in 2023. Most of the action comes from a decline in the frequency of price increases, is much lower in the US, In the goods sector, there is not a lot of problems, actually. In goods sector, more or less things work as expected. In fact, the frequency rises modestly over time. About the size of price changes in the service sector, there is a modest rise, actually, from phase 1 to phase 2, but the time series is quite bumpy. And is comparable to US. If anything, price changes in the US are lower than in Japan. And the size in terms, the size remains quite stable in the goods sector instead. The authors consider a menu cost model calibrated to match price setting during phase 1. So they find asymmetric menu cost in phase 1, which means it's less expensive to raise services prices, but more expensive to lower service prices, consistent with the conventional wisdom of downward rigidities. Authors double check there are occasional types here and there, but easy to fix. More expensive is to change prices in Japan than in the US, which seems to suggest that the zero norm would have not have occurred in the US, other things equal. Even if you had experienced the same kind of inflation dynamics, we would not have observed anything like the zero norm. When they feed through the actual aggregate sectoral inflation in the model, they focus on services, which are most of the action anyway, and they consider two models, one aggregate and one item-based. So they conclude the role of inflation, is a glass half full, half empty. The aggregate model predicts smaller changes in the frequency of price adjustment, but the prediction is smaller than observed, especially the frequency of price increases, which is the key of emergence of a zero norm. And symmetric menu cost actually would make the prediction even worse. In fact, roughly half of the rise in the share of zero inflation items is explained by a decline in the inflation rate. So what happens to the rest? The answer is, well, model parameters must have changed. You need an increase in the size of menu cost for upward adjustment, which helps explain a fall in the frequency of price adjustments in both directions, actually. And you need an increase in the demand curvature, actually the degree of kinkedness of demand. A price drop implies a small increase in demand, a price rise generates a large fall in demand, and this I expect to be even worse during the phase 2. In tandem with low inflation, this helps explaining the fall in frequency of price hikes. So a key feature of the model is the assumption, is the belief that parameters value calibrating using data for phase 1 do not fit the size and frequency in phase 1, and there is a working assumption that some kind of structural break must have happened between one phase and another. Here, the first question for the authors or for everybody on the floor is, perhaps there is a different interpretation that would call into question the modeling approach. We don't have a compelling explanation why these parameter values might have changed. So perhaps there is some problem with a modeling approach and not with the structural parameters. Starting with the obvious, let's think about asymmetric adjustment cost. A menu cost is nothing else but a metaphor for the general reoptimization frictions involved in the process of price setting. In this connection, there is no compelling explanation of why firms would face asymmetric menu costs different from price hikes and price cuts. So isn't it an ex-post exercise in fitting the model to the observed frequency of size and size of price changes? Interestingly, remember that menu costs in phase 1 are larger for price cuts than menu costs for price hikes in phase 1. But in order to explain phase 1, you need basically to have less asymmetry and actually to revert the asymmetry. So you need a larger cost for price hikes in order to explain these results. So more generally, is the evidence on asymmetric menu cost and changes in this cost over time kind of a signal that there is something wrong, perhaps, in terms of a specification of a model? And that's a question for you guys. If you look at a few recent references on menu cost models, Alvarez et al. On the QJE look at the evidence on Argentina and find no decline in the frequency of price changes and no asymmetries in frequency and size of price adjustments, suggesting that perhaps Clearly, each country is different, but Japan is probably even more different than other comparable episodes of disinflation. Blanco, Bohr, Jones, Midrigan consider why standard menu cost models struggle to match the empirical correlation between frequency and inflation, and suggest a few things to fix the model: imperfect substitution at a given firm, strategic complementarity at the firm level, not at the product level. Maybe it's worth trying in the Japanese case, I don't know. Aruba and Al are probably the closest one to the current model. They also feature Kimball demand. One thing that most papers in the literature seem to suggest is that there is a trick that you need to use, which is having the menu cost being randomly drawn from some kind of distribution. Without this, the model doesn't seem to be able to produce enough small price changes. I don't know whether this would help explaining the emergence of a zero norm or make it harder, but I will consider trying. Quasi-King demand curve, a big fan of those. This is a big driver of price rigidity. It's important to explain the results in the model. And in fact, the literature has continued to use this assumption and to find evidence consistent with it. There is a recent market paper by Duprat that considers a little bit the state of the art on this. The question is, the real question, I think, is what explains the change in the curvature of demand during phase 2? Are we talking about the changes in consumer psychology, in the degree of sectoral competition? We're talking about enhanced strategic complementarity. What is the narrative? What is the story? Why during phase 2 and not early? Why not later? And why for such a long time? Idiosyncratic shocks. Besides high menu cost and steeper demand curve, another possibility that they consider is a change in the variance of idiosyncratic productivity shocks. That doesn't help, because actually the variance goes up during phase 2, which, other things equal, would imply an increase in the frequency of price adjustment, including price increases. And you need the increase in the variance to explain the size, but clearly there is a problem there. You don't want to emphasize this aspect too much. The paper by Aruba actually argues that idiosyncratic demand shocks rather than productivity shocks might help explain patterns in the US data. So, question for you, would this help considering idiosyncratic shocks in demand rather than just productivity? So, possibly, and that's a point that was stressed at the end of the presentation, all these structural breaks are somewhat related. In fact, there is some evidence that decreased inflation was associated with a rise in menu cost and the curvature of demand after a 3 or 4 years lag. But the paper is silent about the narrative and the causality. So the question for everybody here is, what would be reasonable candidates for common drivers which are simultaneously underlying unmoored inflation expectations, increased caution in price setting in the services sector, and enhanced perceived sensitivity to price hikes by Japanese households? I don't know what could be a reasonable story. My first feeling is that perhaps this has something to do with demographic factors and the graying of Japanese society that seems to be more or less a driving force underlying all these changes in one shot. But that's a question really for everybody here. I can probably skip some of the more technical slides that you can find anyway if you want in the package. I want to go to a final thought about the zero inflation norm, which seems very much to a US observer like a variant of enhanced price stickiness. That's exactly what we would have in new Keynesian models. In that sense, perhaps trying to explain the increasing prevalence of zero price changes in the 90s and 2000s seems very much related to the literature trying to measure and explain the flattening of a Phillips curve over a similar period, which obviously was not a Japanese phenomenon only. So what do the authors think about the flattening of a Phillips curve as a global phenomenon? How do their findings for Japan shed light on the broader international stylus facts, or do we really stress that Japan was really an outlier there and was really different from everything? And relatedly, most of the menu cost literature seems to be interested in understanding how much monetary non-neutrality can be obtained in the model. So a natural question would be, how does the model implied degree of non-neutrality vary over time? And I will conclude by stating, once again, this is a very compelling paper. Changes in size and especially frequency of price adjustment in Japan have been more pervasive than would have been expected on the basis of inflation performance, and this is this is not an obvious result. There is obviously room for further analysis, and I suggest 3 important dimensions for you and for the audience. First, is this specific of Japan, or this is a local variant of a more general international global phenomenon? Second, what are the relevant narratives to explain, to rationalize the timing and the persistence of the zero norm, not just to show that it happened, but try to give me a story for why this happened in this particular way, and why all the variables move together in order to rationalize the emergence of a zero norm. And finally, and probably most important for a policy conference, is this over by now? We are in the phase 3. Is this over, or it could be repeated? Should the BOJ worry about the resurgence of a zero norm in the medium term? And I'll leave you on this nightmare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, if you respond briefly.
Okay, so thank you, Paolo, for the wonderful discussion, and I think you read the paper really thoroughly, and there were many constructive suggestions which are very much worth taking, which are much worth trying. So it'll be nice if we can discuss them, all of them, but given the time I have, I want to reply to some of the points you raised that would stimulate the floor discussions. So the first question was whether this zero norm is specific to Japan or not. And I think the short answer for this is no, for 3 reasons. First, our model suggests that half of the glass of the zero norm, right here, can be filled with a decline in trend inflation if we assume asymmetric menu cost. So that's a quite general result. Second, the general concept of norm was discussed as mainly as a fairness concept during the 1970s and 80s, such as in Hogen. So the concept itself is rather a traditional take on how inflation fluctuates. And third, in the data, zero norm is not observed in most advanced economies, but we went on a hunt for zero norm-like countries, and we found that in some European periphery countries, there were some zero norm type actions after the debt crisis around 2012. It was Greece, yes. Okay, so although it's not common, it could happen given the circumstances. So in what kind of situation is the next question, which relates to your second point about the relevant narratives. In Japan's story, as the Deputy Governor Uchida expressed in his talk earlier today, so many possible explanations for the formation of the zero norm is present, such as sequence of large negative demand shocks, labor hoarding, severe competition, etc. And as side evidence, indeed, our estimation of price markups declined in the early 2000s, which indicate increased competitiveness both in the goods and service sectors. And once again, our survey results also show that firms perceived price competition was severely strong during these times, and also cared about reputations. And based on our model, if I were to give a rather bold generalization of the model, the formation of the zero norm could stem from a combination of LOA, R star, combined with a long duration of ZLB spell. So the upper channel is the standard endogenous channel, which we could only fill half of the glass with, right? So, but when low inflation persists, unorthodox things can kick in. First, I think the work by Ilut 2020, the econometrica paper, is relevant in the sense that demand uncertainty leads to expansions of the inaction regions. And those types of reasonings are really, I think, are relevant. And second, firms may forget know-how to change prices. And if these are the case, the policy implications will be to adopt unconventional policies when approaching the zero lower bound. Lastly, you mentioned if the zero norm is over for us, and if we are worried of its re-emergence. And given our results, the zero norm seems to be over in the current state. So yes, but could re-emerge if things get really bad. For example, like a really large negative demand shock hits the economy and things like that. However, given that we also learned a lot of lessons during this past 25 years, the re-emergence could ultimately depend on our policy actions as well. So, yeah. So those are my three broad responses, and I have short answers for your many suggestions. And I think some of the methods that you suggested might also be able to explain the formation of the zero norm. For example, Blanco et al., they use the multi-product setup with substitution, non-perfect substitution, right? And those types of profiles are really close to our kinked demand profile, so we may have some potential there. I'm not really sure about the random menu cost because our item level estimates of menu costs show that they were pretty fat-tailed in phase 2. So if you assume a stationary randomness over the whole sample period, that might not be enough. And other points, flattening of Phillips curve. I think Japan was part of the global phenomenon, but that inflation expectations got stuck to zero. So I think we're no exceptions there. In terms of monetary neutrality, I think there were a lot of frictions in phase 2, so there should have been more monetary neutrality in phase 2. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now floor is open, so if you have any questions or comments, please raise your nameplate. And so John Cochran, please.
Sorry, I tried to not go first. This is a great paper, and I want to thank both you and this morning. So I learned about this zero norm. I learned something from coming. Great, you know, this fascinating thing going on. But I'm curious about, so do we really learn about the zero norm or something unusual, or do we learn about menu cost models and their limitations? I say this because the zero norm seems so intuitively plausible. If I'm going to Marcus, you know, I'm raising your prices this year, inflation's 2%, I'm going to charge you 2% more. It starts, well, inflation isn't 2% in Palo Alto, buddy, so, you know, what's going on here? And not in our industry, and we start to argue. Zero is zero. You know, no way you can argue. So that's very, I can sort of see it coming out. But you say, you know, it's coming out more than the model says. Of course, the menu cost model is there's zero cost for if you don't change at all, and then cost of changing it. But already you say firms are reluctant to change downward. Wait a minute, cost is cost. If the problem is it's costly to change the stickers, it's the same cost whether you're putting a number up or a number down. And then of course there's no cost, in that once you've changed it all, there's no extra cost for changing a lot, whereas we know firms are more reluctant to change by a lot than a little. So how can I put that in forms of question? I'm curious what you did about, in pricing data, seasonals, sales, all the things that we know in pricing data, you see a lot of movement. Now, I know in US work, what people do with menu cost models is, well, I'll center it around zero cost for raising at 2%. and because otherwise it doesn't work, and I'll throw out the seasonals and the sales where you're actually changing the prices like crazy. And what you're really getting is a flavor. This is a strategic interaction question. It's not about menu costs. So is some of the difficulty really just the straitjacket of the formal menu cost as opposed to the thing we really know is going on, which is the strategic interaction question between people?
Professor Olfani です。
Thank you. It's fascinating how many elements you bring into this paper. So beautifully done in that way. But I wanted to ask: do you also cover the idea that I recall in a paper by Julio Rottenberg 20 years ago about anger? So it's if prices increases are unfair, then customers get riled up. Actually, this is part of what we see with the spike in inflation right now. Is this part of any of the models coming from preferences? And do we have any, I wonder if you want to compare countries, do we have any data that you can say the Japanese consumer gets angrier sooner than the American consumer, which is why you would have a zero norm here, but not really a zero norm in the US, and so forth. So I wonder if you cover that, the Julio Rottenberg story from 20 years ago in this setting.
Okay, Dr. Segendorf.
Yes, thank you. You can hear me? So I'm bringing the labor market again. Thank you for a very, very nice and interesting talk. So I'm also curious about this narrative and the causality question, and like how you get stuck in the zero inflation or price increasing norm. So I was wondering about wage setting and profits of firm and different sectors. Is it very different in different sectors? The service sector employ more people and they usually have lower profits. So does that matter? And is that something that could add to the narrative? Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Iwata.
Comment that in response to the comment by Dr. Pesenti, Sudo-san answered whether the aging society or the graying society would have some effect or not, and your answer is intuitively no. But I was wondering, maybe yes. My ground for thinking so is the social norm, how the social norm is formed. This is a basic question. And I find in the multi-stage game theory, for instance, Professor Kandori on social norm is formed by the punishment for the defectors. Repeated defection will lead to the cooperation and maintaining the norm. So I find in the graying society implies that diminishing size of market as a whole, diminishing size of market economy and expanding market size of economy, which would have the implication on the size of punishment would be larger in the case of Japanese firms. So that would strengthen the power of social norm. So therefore, I think looking at the outcome, the curvature is exercising more strong effect compared with the asymmetric menu cost. Then this future size of market could have create the difference between United States and Japan.
Okay, thank you. So you have 6 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. So first up from Professor Cochran. So we received, thank you for your questions and comments. And so what did we learn from this whole exercise? We tried a lot of different specifications, and we don't bet on a certain story. it can either be the case that menu costs were fixed and the kinkedness did all the work. That could be one possibility. And if the other possibility could be that they moved together. So we don't really have a stand on which is more likely, but it seems that one of these factors kicked in really hard on our economy during these times. So that's what we found out. And just by using a regular menu cost model doesn't really help us to kind of capture the changes in the gross frequency. There's a strong position by Alvarez that the frequencies don't change with changes in inflation because there are some firms going into the inaction region and some going out when inflation goes down. So it doesn't really have implications for the gross frequency, but you need some other profiles to kind of generate this type of zero norm. So I guess it's kind of, it goes to some limitations or, you know, some profiles that are needed into the standard menu cost model to explain the Japanese type phenomenon. Thank you. And in terms of the sales and all the wiggly actions, we got rid of those and just focused on the regular prices, which are first order importance, I guess. And the second question was from Mr. Orfantes. So do we capture unfairness in our model? And I think it's up, it shows up somewhere, especially in the strategic complementarity part. Because when the Japanese narrative is that, you know, Japan's demand was weak after the domestic financial crisis. In those types of situations, if firms raise prices due to some demand factor, the households are going to like it. So they're going to perceive that as unfair. And that's, I guess, is captured in the strategic complementarity profile. But I'm aware that there are other papers out there that try to model the fairness concerns more formally. So maybe we can have a different explanations if we use different models. So, and the third comment was the wage setting. Wage setting. I think the implications, the wage setting narratives, I think these are really important because in Japan's case, for example, the rise in the share of part-time workers were mostly concentrated in the non-manufacturing sector. And for example, there's a survey, BOJ survey in the early 2000s that asked firms, what are your objectives in this, you know, horrible 2000 situation? And they said, okay, so the firm's objective is to secure profits. And from our other analysis, this suggests that firms decided to hold the prices fixed and decided to lower their labor costs by hiring part-time workers to secure profits. So that's my implantation, that's my understanding. And it shows up in our estimates of wage markdowns. So these part-time workers don't really have a bargaining power of wages. So the labor share as a whole was stable for Japan, but if you decompose that into the contribution of price markups and wage markdowns, there were two opposing forces to make the labor share stable. And wage markdowns was a big, is very important for Japan's economy, and that's my view. So the wage setting matters a lot, and so the question is, where does that come into play in our model, I guess? I think that comes into us flushing in the aggregate inflation into the step 2 part. So aggregate inflation didn't rise, but that doesn't help us explain the zero norm. So we've tried specifications where we feed in wage growth into the model. rather than aggregate inflation. But the model suggests that firms should decrease prices more, but they didn't. So I think there's more we can do, but just off the basic Nakamura's Dyson type exercise, that's our understanding for now. And thirdly, and lastly, Iwata commented on the implications of grain. So is this relevant? And I prematurely wrote on the slide that my intuitive answer is no. But as you mentioned, if we think more deeply about what the grain could affect more indirect effects of the grain society, the answers could be yes. So I admit, I think I was premature in saying no. But for example, if you look at the data for about, for example, foreign direct investments for Japan, the share has risen quite a bit in this 10 years. And if you ask the firms, why do you go abroad? They say, oh, it's the aging society. There's no domestic demand in Japan, so we're not going to invest in Japan and do R&Ds here. We're going to go abroad. And I think that has serious implications for the weak real growth that we experience during these times. So if we think of the other channels coming from grain, I think it's quite substantial. So I don't mean to rule out those channels.
Thank you very much. So time is running out, so I would like to close the. Or would you like to respond? Other? Okay. So I would like to close the session 2, and thank you very much for speaker and discussion. We had a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.